The echo of Italian leather shoes against imported marble filled the opulent lobby of the Manhattan Grand Hotel, a palace of wealth where power brokers made deals that could topple governments. But as Donald Robinson, the city's most feared mafia boss, crossed that gleaming threshold, something stopped him cold. A woman in a plain gray shirt stood near the reception desk, and when her sleeve shifted just enough, he saw marks that no one in his world was supposed to ignore. What happened next would shake New York's underworld to its core and prove that even the most ruthless man has a line he won't let anyone cross. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and also drop a comment letting us know the country where you're watching from. Your support helps us in creating more amazing stories, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's jump right into the story. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of the Manhattan Grand, casting golden rays across a lobby that existed for one purpose: to remind ordinary people they didn't belong. This was the domain of the untouchable, where billionaires conducted business over $1,000 scotch and politicians sealed backroom deals that would never see daylight. The air itself seemed expensive, perfumed with old money and newer ambitions. Into this cathedral of privilege walked Donald Robinson, and the atmosphere shifted. His reputation arrived before he did. Ex-military tactician, self-made empire builder, and a man who controlled New York's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in bespoke tailoring. The ink creeping up his neck and across his knuckles told a story his expensive suit tried to hide. He lived by one unbreakable code: control everything, trust no one, and never let emotion compromise the empire. Donald wasn't looking for distractions that day. He had flown in from a territorial negotiation in Chicago, his mind calculating the multi-million-dollar deal waiting for him in the executive suite upstairs. A deal that would cement his organization's dominance for the next decade. His second-in-command, Victor, walked 2 steps behind, briefcase in hand, reviewing last-minute details. As his entourage moved through the lobby, conversations died. Businessmen suddenly found their phones fascinating. Hotel staff busied themselves with invisible tasks. The sight of Robinson's cold, calculating eyes and the subtle bulge beneath his subordinates' jackets was enough to make even the boldest person look away. But Donald's attention snagged on something out of place. Near the marble reception desk stood a young woman with hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her name tag identified her as Maria McWilliams, cleaning staff. Everything about her screamed invisible, the kind of person the wealthy learned not to see. She clutched a clipboard to her chest, her plain gray shirt and worn jeans a stark contrast to the designer labels floating through the space around her. Donald, trained to read every room he entered, caught the small details others would miss. The way her shoulders hunched slightly inward, as if trying to make herself smaller. The way her eyes darted to the elevator bank every few seconds, tracking someone's movements. The long sleeves she wore despite the late spring warmth flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And when she reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, her sleeve slipped just enough. Dark purple and angry red bruises painted her delicate cheek and jawline. Fresh ones layered over older, yellowing marks. These weren't the remnants of a clumsy accident or a one-time incident. These were the signature of systematic cruelty, deliberate, repeated, and vicious. Donald's expression remained carved from stone, but something ignited behind his eyes. He'd seen those marks before, in another life, on another face he'd failed to protect. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When a hotel manager barked something at Maria from across the lobby, she flinched, a full-body recoil that spoke of conditioned fear. The survival instinct of someone who'd learned that sudden movements or loud voices preceded pain. Victor leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "Boss, we're already 10 minutes behind. The partners are waiting upstairs. This deal." Donald held up one finger, silencing him without a word. His gaze never left Maria, tracking her as she turned away from the desk, her movements careful and practiced. He watched her interact with a tall, sneering man in an ill-fitting manager's uniform who stood near the service corridor. The man said something that made Maria's face pale, and when he brushed past her, his shoulder check was deliberate enough to make her stumble. Donald's hand curled into a fist at his side, the only outward sign of the cold fury building in his chest. "The meeting can wait," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My priorities just changed." Victor's face betrayed a flicker of shock before his professional mask slammed back into place. "Boss, with all due respect, we've been negotiating this arrangement for 6 months. The Russians won't." Did I stutter? Donald's words came out low and lethal, each syllable dropping like a blade. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Call upstairs. Tell them I'm delayed. Tell them whatever the hell you want. But do not tell me what my priorities are." Victor knew better than to push further. He'd seen men buried in the Hudson for less. With a curt nod, he retreated, phone already pressed to his ear, leaving Donald to the sudden obsession that had derailed a multi-million-dollar deal. Donald's focus locked onto Maria with the same surgical precision he'd once used to identify enemy combatants in the dark. Every detail cataloged itself in his mind like evidence at a crime scene. The way she held herself rigid when the sneering manager passed, as if bracing for impact. The slight hitch in her breath when a security guard's radio crackled too close behind her. The practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to be invisible because visibility meant pain. He watched the security guard, an overfed man with a badge that meant nothing in Donald's world, lumber past her toward the elevators. The guard's arms swung wide, not quite touching her, but close enough. Maria's reaction was instantaneous and damning. She jerked backward, clipboard clutched like a shield, her eyes squeezing shut for just a fraction of a second before she caught herself. The fear was muscle memory. Instinctive. The kind you didn't learn from one bad day. Donald's jaw worked as he pieced it together with the cold calculation that had made him untouchable in a city full of predators. The bruises weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. The flinching wasn't paranoia. It was conditioning. Someone had been using this woman as a punching bag, and they'd been doing it long enough that her body anticipated violence before it even arrived. He'd seen this before. In war zones where warlords kept villages terrified. In his own territory, when he'd had to make examples of men who thought power meant preying on the weak. The rage that built in his chest was familiar, a cold, focused fury that turned men into ghosts. Without another word to his remaining security detail, Donald moved. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, the gait of a man who'd never been told no in his life. Conversations around him dried up like water on hot asphalt. A lawyer clutching a briefcase actually stepped behind a marble column. Smart man. Maria didn't notice him approaching at first. She was too busy pretending to review something on her clipboard, her hand trembling just slightly as she gripped the pen. But then his shadow fell across her paperwork, eclipsing the expensive chandelier light, and she looked up. Her eyes went wide. Those bruised, exhausted eyes that had probably stopped hoping for rescue years ago. Donald towered over her, his presence swallowing the space between them. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute command. The kind of voice that ended arguments before they started. The kind that made grown men confess sins they'd never committed. "Tell me your name, girl." It wasn't a request. "And who did that to you?" Maria's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, frozen in the presence of something far more dangerous than anything she'd encountered before. Her clipboard trembled in her grip, and Donald could see her pulse hammering in the hollow of her throat. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper, thin and rehearsed. I'm Maria. Maria McWilliams." She swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the marble floor between them. "It's nothing, sir. I'm clumsy. I fell down the stairs at my apartment building 2 days ago. It looks worse than it is." The lie was immediate. Practiced. The kind of story that had probably been told to concerned neighbors, skeptical nurses, maybe even police who didn't care enough to dig deeper. Her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd repeated the same script so many times she almost believed it herself. Donald's expression didn't change, but something lethal flickered behind his eyes. He'd interrogated enemy combatants who lied better than this. She couldn't even meet his gaze when she said it. In one fluid movement, his hand shot out and closed around her wrist, not the bruised one. He noticed that detail even through his anger, with a grip that was firm, unyielding, and completely controlled. Not enough to hurt, but enough to make it clear she wasn't walking away until he allowed it. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling her heartbeat spike into panic rhythm. He leaned down, close enough that his next words existed only for her. His breath ghosted across her ear, his voice dropping to a register that most people only heard once in their lives, right before everything went dark. "Don't lie to me." Each word was carved from ice and wrapped in barbed wire. "It's a mistake you won't survive." Maria went absolutely rigid, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The clipboard clattered to the floor, forgotten. But Donald's attention had already fractured. His peripheral vision, trained through years of watching for threats in every room he entered, caught movement near the service corridor. A man in a hotel manager's uniform, cheap polyester that bunched at the shoulders, name tag reading, R. Jennings, shift manager, stood watching them with an expression Donald recognized instantly. It wasn't concern. It wasn't curiosity. It was possession. Territorial and smug. The look of a predator watching someone else touch his prey, annoyed by the interruption, but not yet worried. Jennings's lips curled into something that might have been a smile if it had contained even a trace of humanity. His arms were crossed over his chest, his stance deliberately casual, but his eyes held a challenge. A silent message, "She's mine. Back off." Donald read the entire dynamic in less than 3 seconds. The way Maria's breathing had gone shallow the moment Jennings appeared in her line of sight. The way her free hand had instinctively moved to cover the bruise on her cheek. The way Jennings stood just far enough away to maintain plausible deniability, but close enough to remind her he was always watching. Prey and predator. The oldest story in the world, playing out in a 5-star hotel lobby in broad daylight. Donald's grip on Maria's wrist tightened fractionally, a silent claim that shifted the entire power structure in the room. His head turned slowly, deliberately, until his gaze locked with Jennings's across the polished marble expanse. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message was clear. You just made a fatal mistake. Donald released Maria's wrist with deliberate care, his fingers trailing away in a gesture that somehow felt more possessive than the grip itself. He didn't look at her when he spoke, his gaze still locked on Jennings like a missile acquiring its target. "Stay here." 2 words, absolute command. Then, over his shoulder to the security detail that had materialized at a respectful distance, "Keep her here. No one touches her. No one speaks to her. Am I clear?" The lead guard, a former Marine who'd seen combat in Fallujah, simply nodded. He knew better than to question orders delivered in that tone. Victor emerged from the elevator bank, phone still pressed to his ear, his expression caught between professional concern and barely concealed panic. "Boss, they're getting restless upstairs. Volkov's attorney is threatening to Wakif. Let him walk." Donald's voice carried across the lobby with terrifying calm. He straightened his cuffs with mechanical precision, a gesture that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. "Tell them I'm postponing. Tell them whatever diplomatic bullshit you need to tell them. This can wait. My priorities have shifted." Victor's face went pale. 6 months of negotiations. $15 million in territory agreements. The kind of deal that men killed for, being tossed aside like yesterday's newspaper for a woman in a gray shirt with bruises on her face. But he'd worked for Donald Robinson long enough to know that when the boss used that particular tone, flat, emotionless, final, arguing was signing your own death warrant. "Understood, boss." Victor retreated toward the elevators, already composing whatever lie would keep the Russians from declaring war over the insult. Donald moved across the lobby with the purposeful stride of a man who'd never encountered a locked door that mattered. Jennings, to his credit or his stupidity, held his ground near the service corridor. The sneer had faded somewhat, replaced by calculation. He was probably trying to figure out who this tattooed suit was and why he cared about some disposable cleaning girl. He'd understand soon enough. Donald didn't say a word as he approached. Didn't need to. His presence did the talking. When he was close enough, he simply gestured with one finger toward the service corridor, a small, almost casual movement that carried the weight of inevitability. Jennings hesitated for just a moment before his survival instincts kicked in. Whatever else he was, the man could read danger when it was standing 2 feet away, promising violence. They disappeared into the corridor together, Donald following Jennings past the employee break room into a storage area filled with linens and cleaning supplies. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a coffin ceiling. The space was cramped, windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent strips that buzzed with electrical hum. It smelled of bleach and desperation. Perfect. Donald stood between Jennings and the only exit, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture almost casual. He didn't need to posture. His reputation did that work for him. But Jennings didn't know who he was yet, and that ignorance gave him a few more seconds of false courage. Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but that girl is hotel property, and you need to. Hotel property. Donald's voice was so soft it barely disturbed the air between them. He took one step forward. Jennings took one step back, his spine hitting a metal shelving unit with a hollow clang. Interesting choice of words. Donald didn't touch him. Didn't need to. He simply closed the distance until Jennings could probably count the individual threads in his $1,000 suit, until the bigger man's carefully constructed authority crumbled under the weight of something far older and far more primal than employment hierarchies. She belongs to me now. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in every direction. If I see your face in this city again, hell, if I hear your name whispered in a bar in Jersey, I'll send back pieces. Small ones. To everyone who ever gave a damn about you. Starting with your mother in Queens. Jennings's face went white. Donald emerged from the storage room 2 minutes later, his suit unwrinkled, his expression serene. Behind him, Jennings remained pressed against the shelving unit, his breathing ragged, sweat beading across his forehead despite the air-conditioned chill. He looked like a man who'd just seen his death certificate signed and dated. Maria stood exactly where Donald had left her, flanked by his security detail like a museum piece under guard. Her eyes tracked his approach with a mixture of terror and something else, something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been beaten out of her months ago. She clutched her clipboard to her chest like armor that had already failed once. Donald didn't break stride as he reached her. His hand closed around her upper arm, gentle enough not to hurt, firm enough to make it clear this wasn't a request, and he guided her toward the hotel's main entrance. She stumbled slightly, her legs not quite cooperating, shock turning her bones to water. Wait, I can't. I have my shift, I need to. Her protests came out weak, disjointed, the words of someone who knew they wouldn't matter. You don't work here anymore, Donald said simply, navigating them through the lobby. Heads turned. Whispers erupted in their wake. By night, the entire hotel staff would be speculating about what they'd witnessed. Good. Let them talk. As they pushed through the brass-trimmed revolving door into the Manhattan afternoon, Maria caught sight of movement near the service entrance. 2 men in dark suits, Donald's men, she realized with creeping certainty, were escorting Jennings out a side exit. Her former manager wasn't fighting them, wasn't protesting. He moved like a puppet with cut strings, his face still drained of color, his eyes fixed on the pavement. They guided him into the back of an idling black SUV, with tinted windows so dark they seemed to swallow light. The door closed. The SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic like it had never existed at all. Maria's breath caught in her throat. Who are you? Donald's answer was immediate, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to order coffee. Your protection. The drive through Manhattan was silent except for the muted sounds of traffic filtering through bulletproof glass. Maria sat rigid in the leather seat, her hands folded in her lap, her mind trying to process what had just happened. One moment she'd been enduring another shift under Jennings's sadistic supervision. The next, a tattooed man in an expensive suit had dismantled her entire reality in less than 10 minutes. The SUV pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that screamed exclusivity, the kind of address that didn't advertise because the people who mattered already knew. Donald guided her into a private elevator that required a keycard and a fingerprint scan. The ascent was smooth, silent, and seemingly endless. When the doors opened, Maria stepped into a penthouse that could have been featured in architectural magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city sprawling below, like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. The furniture was all clean lines and cold surfaces, black leather, chrome, marble. Beautiful, expensive, utterly devoid of warmth. It felt like walking into a museum after hours, when all the velvet ropes had been removed but the do-not-touch rules still applied. The space was immaculate to the point of sterility. No personal photographs. No clutter. No evidence that an actual human being lived here, rather than a very wealthy ghost. Maria stood in the center of the vast living room, her worn sneakers sinking into carpet that probably cost more than her annual salary, and realized with creeping certainty that she'd escaped one cage only to find herself in another. This one just had better furniture. Donald shrugged out of his suit jacket, draping it over a chair with practiced ease, the movement revealing the shoulder holster he wore like a second skin. He caught her staring and didn't bother hiding it. "You're safe here," he said, pouring 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter. He offered her one, which she took with trembling hands. "No one comes in without my permission. That includes you going out." A gilded cage indeed. Maria stood frozen in the center of the penthouse, the water glass clutched between both hands like it might anchor her to reality. Everything about this place screamed power she couldn't comprehend. The art on the walls that was probably worth more than her childhood home, the view that made Manhattan look like a toy city, the man standing 10 feet away who just erased another human being from existence with nothing but words. She was terrified. Bone-deep, existential terror that made her previous fear of Jennings seem almost quaint by comparison. But underneath that fear was something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation: safety. The knowledge that no one was going to hit her tonight. That she could close her eyes without calculating escape routes. The contradiction was making her dizzy. Donald watched her with an intensity that should have been threatening, but somehow wasn't. He moved to a bathroom off the main living area and returned with a first aid kit that looked military-grade. When he gestured to the leather sofa, she sat mechanically, her body obeying before her mind could catch up. He knelt in front of her, and the sight of this dangerous, powerful man lowering himself to her level did something strange to her chest. His hands, large enough to snap bones without effort, reached for her face with a hesitation she never would have expected. The first touch of his fingers against her bruised cheek was so gentle it almost broke her. "This is going to sting," he warned, his voice rougher than before, like the words were being dragged through gravel. He opened an antiseptic wipe, and Maria caught the tremor in his hand, barely visible, there and gone in a heartbeat, but she saw it. This man who'd terrorized Jennings without breaking a sweat was shaking as he cleaned her wounds. The antiseptic burned, but Maria didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago not to show pain. Donald worked with methodical care, his massive fingers impossibly delicate as they traced the damage someone else had inflicted. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "You're afraid of me," he said quietly. Not a question. An observation that seemed to bother him more than it should. Yes. Maria saw no point in lying. He'd probably seen through every lie she'd ever told within seconds of meeting her. Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or recognition. "I'm not him. I'll never be him." "You're worse." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she braced for anger. But Donald just paused, a fresh bandage halfway to her cheek, and waited. So she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jennings hurt me because I was there. You're dangerous because you chose to be." He absorbed that like a physical blow, then resumed tending to her injuries with even greater care. The silence stretched between them, heavy with truths neither of them wanted to examine too closely. "Tell me about Jennings."
It wasn't a command this time.
It was an invitation, offered in a voice that held a gentleness she wouldn't have thought him capable of. "Tell me how deep this goes." Maria's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She'd cried herself dry months ago. He wasn't working alone. There's a man in Queens, Mickey Santos. He's a dealer, uses hotel staff to move cash through the building. Jennings ran the operation on the Manhattan side. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see one night, and after that. She touched her cheek, the gesture saying what words couldn't. Donald's hand stilled against her skin. Santos. He said no one would ever care about a girl like me. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. He said I was invisible, that I could disappear and the world wouldn't even notice. Donald's fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. What she saw there wasn't pity. It was fury, barely leashed, burning cold and absolute. He was wrong, Donald said, and it sounded like a vow. The world's about to notice you're the only person in this city who matters. Mickey Santos heard about Jennings within 2 hours. The streets talked, and when a shift manager vanished into a black SUV in broad daylight, people noticed. When that same manager turned up on a Greyhound bus to Atlanta with a one-way ticket and terror in his eyes, refusing to say who'd put him there, the message became crystal clear. Someone powerful had intervened. Santos didn't like intervention. He especially didn't like losing assets he'd cultivated over months of careful intimidation and strategic violence. The hotel operation had been clean, profitable, moving nearly $50,000 a week through seemingly legitimate channels. And now some tattooed suit thought he could just walk in and dismantle it over a cleaning girl? Santos made calls, asked questions, found out the suit had taken the girl, found out where the suit lived, a fortress of a building in Midtown with security that would make the Secret Service jealous. Smart men would have walked away. But Santos had built his reputation on being willing to do what smart men wouldn't. If he couldn't touch the suit directly, he'd touch what the suit had taken. 3 days after Maria disappeared from the Manhattan Grand, she woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was just past 3 in the morning, that dead hour when even New York City held its breath. She'd been sleeping in the guest room, a space larger than her entire former apartment, with sheets that felt like liquid silk and a mattress that should have guaranteed dreamless sleep, but didn't. The sound came again. A soft scrape, metal on metal, barely audible over the ambient hum of the city far below. Maria's eyes snapped open, her body already flooding with the adrenaline of someone who'd learned to wake up ready to run. The bedroom door, which Donald had left cracked open despite the advanced security system, suddenly seemed very far away from the bed. She slid from beneath the covers, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, every instinct screaming at her to hide. Another sound, closer now. Footsteps in the hallway, deliberate and wrong. Multiple sets. Men who knew how to move quietly, but not quietly enough. The security system hadn't made a sound. No alarm, no warning, which meant either these men were ghosts or they disabled something that shouldn't have been possible to disable. Maria's hand found her phone on the nightstand just as her bedroom door crashed open. 2 men in dark clothing rushed in, their faces covered with masks that made them look inhuman. The lead one lunged for her, his hand closing around her wrist in a grip that sent pain shooting up her arm. She opened her mouth to scream, but his other hand clamped over her face, cutting off the sound. Got her, he hissed into a radio. East bedroom. We're moving. The lights blazed to life, flooding the room with harsh, white brilliance. The man holding Maria froze, his grip loosening just slightly as his brain tried to process what he was seeing in the doorway. Donald Robinson stood there in nothing but black pajama pants, a gun held steady in his right hand, his expression carved from Arctic ice. Behind him, 2 of his own security team had already moved into position, blocking any escape route the intruders might have considered. You came for her? Donald's voice was so quiet it barely disturbed the air, but it carried the promise of graves being dug. He took 1 step into the room, then another, his bare feet silent on the floor. Then you come for me. The gun in his hand never wavered. The intruders realized their mistake in the same instant they realized it was too late to correct it. What happened next was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. Donald moved like violence given human form, every motion economical and precise. The man holding Maria released her so quickly she stumbled backward, but Donald was already there, his body between her and any threat. The first intruder went down from a blow Maria didn't even see delivered. The second lasted 3 seconds longer before joining his companion on the floor, groaning. Donald's security team swept in, securing the barely conscious men with the efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times before. Throughout it all, Donald never lowered his weapon, never took his eyes off the threats, his body angled to shield Maria even as he neutralized the danger. When it was over, when the intruders were zip-tied and bleeding on his expensive hardwood, Donald finally turned to Maria. His chest was heaving slightly, the only sign of exertion, and something feral still burned behind his eyes. "You hurt." 2 words clipped and rough. Maria shook her head, unable to find her voice. Donald's jaw clenched. He looked at his head of security. "Find out who sent them. Then find out where Santos sleeps." Dawn broke over Manhattan with a kind of golden light that made the city look almost innocent, as if murders and corruption didn't happen in a place this beautiful. Donald stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the sunrise paint the skyline in shades of amber and rose. He hadn't slept. Behind him, Maria sat curled on the leather sofa, wrapped in one of his shirts that swallowed her frame, watching him with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. The intruders had been Santos's men, just as Donald knew they would be. Low-level muscle, expendable and stupid, sent on a suicide mission by a man too arrogant to understand what he'd started. They talked eventually. Everyone talked when Donald's people asked the right questions. Santos was operating out of a warehouse in Long Island City, running his pathetic empire with delusions of grandeur and the backing of even more pathetic street dealers who thought numbers mattered more than strategy. Donald set down his coffee with deliberate care, the soft clink of ceramic on marble the only sound in the vast apartment. He'd been calculating angles all night, running scenarios, weighing variables. Every path led to the same conclusion. Maria would never be safe as long as Santos breathed. And hiding her was just prolonging the inevitable. She was a shield he couldn't use and a target he couldn't remove from the board. Which meant the board itself had to be cleared. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled through contacts until he found the number his head of security had provided 3 hours earlier. Santos's personal cell. The fact that a bottom feeder like Santos even existed in Donald's city was an insult. The fact that he'd sent men into Donald's home was a death sentence. Maria watched him dial, her knees drawn up to her chest, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, cocky, unafraid, stupid. "Yeah, Mickey Santos." Donald's voice was conversational, almost friendly. The tone of a man discussing the weather. "You sent men to my home last night. Bold move. Suicidal, but bold." A pause on the other end, then recognition dawning. "Who the fuck is this?" "Donald Robinson." 2 words that dropped like stones into water. He could hear Santos's breathing change, the sudden sharp intake that meant the name had registered, that the street dealer had just realized he'd been playing checkers against a man who owned the chessboard. "You wanted a piece of my business. You just bought a coffin." The silence that followed was beautiful. Donald let it stretch, let the implications sink through whatever drug-addled brain Santos possessed. "Now wait, hold on," Santos started, the cockiness evaporating like water on hot asphalt. "I'm not negotiating.
I'm notifying."
You touched something that belongs to me. You came into my home. Those aren't mistakes you recover from." Donald's voice never changed pitch, never rose above that terrifyingly casual register. "I'm giving you 12 hours to get your affairs in order. Call your mother. Make your peace with whatever god you pretend to believe in. Because at sunset, I'm coming to Queens, and I'm erasing you from this city. You can't just—" "I'm not asking for permission." Donald disconnected the call, the screen going dark in his hand. He stood there for a moment, his reflection ghosted in the window glass, backlit by the rising sun. When he turned, Maria was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, yes. but also something else. Understanding, maybe. Or resignation. You're going to kill him, she said quietly. Not a question. Yes. Because of me. Because he made a choice. They always make choices. Donald moved to the sofa, crouching down in front of her the way he had when he'd cleaned her wounds. His voice softened, just slightly. You need to understand something, Maria. This is who I am. This is what I do. If that terrifies you, I'll find somewhere safe for you to go. But if you stay knowing what I'm capable of. Maria looked at him for a long moment, this dangerous, deadly man who'd turned her world upside down in less than a week. She should run. Every rational cell in her body screamed at her to run. But she'd been running her whole life, and it had never made her safe. I'm staying, she whispered, and watched something fierce and possessive flare in his eyes. The warehouse in Long Island City squatted among abandoned industrial buildings like a cancer on the waterfront, its windows broken and boarded, graffiti crawling up the corrugated metal walls. Donald's intelligence had been precise. Santos ran his operation from the second floor, surrounded by muscle too stupid to realize they were already dead. The building had two entrances, no back exit that wasn't booby-trapped with the kind of amateur explosives that killed more dealers than cops, and exactly 17 men inside who thought numbers meant safety. Donald arrived 30 minutes before sunset with 8 of his best operators and one terrified woman who'd insisted on coming despite every argument he'd made against it. Maria sat in the SUV parked 2 blocks away, Victor beside her with explicit instructions to drive away at the first sign of things going wrong. She wore a bulletproof vest that was too large and carried a phone with one number programmed, Donald's. If I don't walk out of there, Donald had told her, his hands framing her face with unexpected gentleness, you run. You take the money Victor has and you disappear. Understood. She'd nodded, but they both knew she was lying. Donald and his team moved through the warehouse like smoke, their approach silent and coordinated. They'd done this dance before, clearing buildings, neutralizing threats, operating in the space between law and survival where Donald had built his empire. The first floor was empty except for rats and the ghost of industrial ambitions long dead. The stairs to the second floor creaked, a warning that Donald ignored. The second floor door exploded inward under the force of a breaching charge, and chaos erupted like a wound opening. Santos's men scrambled for weapons, but Donald's team was already inside, moving with the lethal efficiency of surgical strikes. Gunfire cracked through the space, controlled bursts, no spray and pray desperation, each shot finding its mark. Donald moved through the center of it all like a conductor leading an orchestra of violence, his focus absolute, his movements economical. 2 men rushed him from the left. He dropped the first with a shot to the chest, pivoted, and put the second down with mechanical precision. No wasted motion. No hesitation. This was what he'd been forged for in deserts half a world away, refined in the streets of New York, perfected through years of necessary brutality. Through it all, even in the midst of chaos, part of his awareness remained locked on the SUV 2 blocks away, on the woman wearing his vest and carrying his number, making sure that if things went wrong, his last act would be ensuring her survival. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears faded to a dull roar, Santos's crew was down, dead or incapacitated, no longer threats. And in the back corner of the warehouse, pressed against a wall with nowhere left to run, Mickey Santos stood with a gun trembling in his hand and the certainty of death written across his face. Donald approached slowly, his own weapon steady, his expression empty of everything except cold purpose. Behind him, his men secured the space, checking bodies, ensuring no surprises. But Donald's focus was entirely on the man who'd sent thugs into his home, who'd put hands on what belonged to him. You made this personal, Donald said, his voice carrying across the warehouse floor. The moment you touched her, you made it personal. Santos's gun hand shook harder. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know she was yours. If I'd known. Ignorance isn't innocence. Donald stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the sweat beading on Santos's forehead, close enough to smell the fear. She was invisible to you. disposable, something to be used and discarded. Please, I can disappear, I can. The shot echoed through the warehouse, final and absolute. Santos dropped, his gun clattering across concrete, his eyes going glassy, with the kind of surprise that came from never truly believing consequences applied to him. Donald stood over the body, his weapon still raised, and delivered his epitaph in a voice that held no satisfaction, only grim finality. The only people allowed to bruise you are me, by accident. He turned and walked away, leaving Santos to bleed out on the floor of his own kingdom, and didn't look back. The news spread through New York's underworld like blood and water. Mickey Santos and his entire crew had vanished overnight, not arrested, not relocated, simply erased. The warehouse in Long Island City sat empty, its doors hanging open like the mouth of a tomb. No bodies were found. No evidence remained. Just the kind of silence that made smart men nervous and stupid men reckless. Within 48 hours, every dealer, every hustler, every bottom feeder who'd ever worked adjacent to Santos's operation knew one absolute truth. Donald Robinson had moved, and when Donald Robinson moved, entire organizations ceased to exist. The streets whispered his name with a kind of reverence usually reserved for natural disasters, something inevitable, unstoppable, and absolutely lethal. The Manhattan Grand Hotel found itself under new management within a week. The entire security team was replaced. 3 managers took early retirement. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers that might get them noticed. Maria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Donald's penthouse, watching the city sprawl below like a kingdom she'd never known existed. The bruises had faded to ghosts beneath her skin, yellow remnants of a life that felt like someone else's nightmare. She wore clothes that actually fit now, designer labels that Donald had ordered without asking, delivered in boxes she'd been too overwhelmed to refuse. Behind her, Donald moved through the space with his usual controlled grace, reviewing documents his lieutenant had brought for his signature. Business continued. Empires didn't run themselves. But every few minutes, his gaze would lift from the paperwork and find her, as if confirming she was still there, still real, still his. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. The door was unlocked. She could leave whenever she wanted. They both knew she wouldn't. "You're thinking too loud," Donald said, his voice carrying across the vast room. He set down his pen, his attention shifting entirely to her. That focus, absolute, unwavering, still made her breath catch. Maria turned from the window, finding him watching her with an expression that might have been concern on anyone else. On him, it looked like possession wrapped in careful restraint. "I'm thinking that I traded one cage for another." "The difference," Donald said, closing the distance between them with measured steps, "is that I'll kill anyone who tries to put you back in one." His hand came up, fingers gentle against her cheek, where the worst bruise had been. "Including myself, if that's what you need." Maria leaned into his touch, this dangerous, deadly man who'd burned down an empire because someone had dared to hurt her. She should be terrified. Part of her still was. But she'd learned something in the past week. Sometimes the monster wasn't the one you needed saving from. Sometimes the monster was the only thing standing between you and a world that wanted to devour you whole. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, and felt his hand tighten against her skin, not in threat, but in promise. The city below continued its endless dance of light and shadow, but up here, in this fortress of glass and steel, Maria finally understood what safety felt like. It wore expensive suits and carried violence in its bones, but it was hers. And in Donald's world, that made her untouchable. So if you believe that even the darkest hearts can find a reason to protect the innocent, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Only those who seeks chaos and destruction won't.